It was a bright summer morning in London, and the sky looked clear above Buckingham Palace. Tourists from different countries had already gathered near the palace gates, holding cameras and phones waiting to see the famous King's Guard. The red uniforms, the tall black bearskin hats, and the way the guard stood so straight always fascinated visitors. Some people came only to take pictures, while others wanted to watch the changing of the guard ceremony. Among the visitors was Li Wei, a man from China who had been dreaming about this trip for many years. For him, this was not just a casual stop. It was something he had always wanted to experience with his own eyes. Li Wei walked with excitement, his small group of friends following him. He carried a camera bag on his shoulder and wore a big smile. Everything around him felt magical. The palace walls, the golden gates, and the crowd of people made him feel like he was in a place full of history and tradition. He had seen pictures of the King's Guard many times on the internet, but now he was standing only a few feet away from them. He could see their shiny boots, their perfectly polished buttons, and how they stood without moving even a finger. As the crowd grew larger, people started pointing their cameras at the guards. Children waved, hoping to get a smile, but the guards stayed completely still. Some laughed quietly, amazed that these men could stand for hours without showing any emotion. Li Wei whispered to his friend, "They look like statues. How can they do this for so long?" His friend shrugged, equally impressed. Li Wei's curiosity grew stronger the more he looked at the guard. He noticed the small wooden box where one guard was standing. The box was painted neatly, designed to protect the guard from rain or harsh sun. Tourists usually kept their distance, but Li Wei thought to himself, "What if I step inside just for one quick photo? It will be a memory I'll never forget." He knew it was probably not allowed, but he thought it was harmless. After all, he had seen other tourists get very close for pictures. He looked around carefully. The guard stood firm, facing forward without any reaction. The crowd was busy talking, taking photos, and laughing. Li Wei thought this was his chance. He moved slowly, pretending to check his camera, and then, with a nervous smile, he stepped into the box beside the guard. His friends gasped softly but quickly raised their cameras, thinking it would be funny to capture the moment. Inside the box, Li Wei tried to mimic the guard's serious expression. He pressed his lips tightly, stood straight, and looked forward just like the soldier. Tourists nearby noticed and started whispering. A few laughed, pointing at him. Others shook their heads, knowing this was disrespectful. One elderly man in the crowd muttered, "This is not a joke. He shouldn't be doing that." But nobody stopped him right away. Everyone was too curious to see what would happen next. For a moment, Li Wei felt proud of himself. He thought it was harmless fun, a small action that would give him a funny picture to show his family back home. He imagined telling the story later. "I stood in the guard's box in London, and nothing happened." He didn't realize that what he was doing was against the rules, and that the guard's job was not only to stand still but also to protect the dignity of the palace. The guard beside him stayed perfectly still. But Li Wei didn't know that the guards were trained to react when someone crossed the line. The air around the palace suddenly felt heavier. Some tourists stopped taking pictures and started recording videos instead, sensing something was about to happen. Children stopped laughing and looked up at the guard with wide eyes. Li Wei adjusted his pose, trying to make it look more serious. His friends whispered nervously, Okay, come out now, that's enough." But before he could move, a deep, commanding voice cut through the noise of the crowd. It was the guard. He had turned slightly, his eyes fixed on Li Wei, and with a loud shout he said, "Get out of the box." The sound was so strong that it felt like thunder. Li Wei froze, his heart beating fast. The crowd went silent, shocked by the sudden break in the guard's stillness. Even the birds above seemed to pause for a moment. No one expected the guard to react so quickly, and certainly not with such power in his voice. The tourists stared, some with open mouths, others already raising their phones higher to record this rare moment. Li Wei's smile disappeared instantly. His face turned red and he felt heat rushing to his ears. He had wanted attention, but now the attention was painful. Hundreds of eyes were on him, and every second felt longer than the last. He quickly stepped out of the box, lowering his head in shame. His friends stopped laughing and slowly put their cameras down. The silence broke when people in the crowd began whispering again. Some were impressed, saying, "That's what happens if you cross the line." Others chuckled. He deserved that shout. A few people shook their heads. feeling sorry for him, but most agreed it was a lesson. The guard had spoken only one sentence, but it carried the weight of tradition, respect, and discipline. Li Wei wanted to disappear in that moment. He looked at his shoes, avoiding eye contact with anyone. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his camera strap. He didn't feel proud anymore. Instead, he felt embarrassed and guilty. The thought of how many people had recorded the scene made him even more nervous. He knew this video might follow him far beyond Buckingham Palace, but deep inside he also began to understand. The guards were not just tourist attractions. They were soldiers serving their country, standing there as a symbol of the royal family and the nation. Their silence was not an invitation to play, but a duty to remain strong. Li Wei realized he had made a mistake, not because he wanted to cause trouble, but because he had not thought carefully about what respect meant in that place. As he rejoined his friends, they tried to cheer him up, but the lesson stayed with him. For the rest of the morning, every time he looked at the guard, he felt a mix of awe and humility. The memory he thought would be funny had turned into a story he would never forget, for a very different reason. And in the quiet of his heart, he promised himself that whenever he traveled to another country again, he would first learn the rules, respect the traditions, and think twice before acting. The shout of the king's guard still echoed in the air, and the crowd remained unusually quiet for a few moments. People who had been laughing or chatting only seconds earlier now looked serious, their faces showing surprise and respect. It was not every day that the guards broke their silence, and when they did, it was always powerful. Li Wei stood there, frozen in embarrassment, trying to recover from the shock. He could still hear the words ringing in his ears. "Get out of the box." That sentence felt louder than any other sound in his life. His friends stood close by, their expressions mixed with worry and amusement. They wanted to comfort him, but they also knew the moment had already been witnessed by hundreds of people. A young boy tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mom, did you hear that guard shout? He really yelled so loud." His mother nodded and reminded him, "That's why we don't disturb them. They're serious." Tourists nearby whispered in different languages, some shaking their heads, others smiling nervously as if they too had learned a lesson without making the same mistake. Li Wei slowly stepped aside, trying to blend into the crowd, but it was impossible. He felt like a spotlight was on him. His face burned with embarrassment and his hands felt heavy at his sides. He wanted to laugh it off, but the weight of the guard's words pressed down on him. His friends finally whispered, "Let's move. Let's go somewhere else." But before they could walk away, another wave of attention spread through the crowd. People began raising their phones higher, zooming in, recording every second. For many of them, this was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, seeing the King's Guard actually respond to a tourist. A group of students from Spain laughed loudly, replaying the moment on their phone screens. Two elderly travelers from America whispered that they hadn't seen anything like this in years of visiting London. Every conversation circled back to the same topic, the shout. It was as though Buckingham Palace had given the crowd a special performance. Li Wei tried to force a smile, telling his friends, "It's okay. It's just a small thing." But inside he felt the sting of regret. He thought of how silly he must have looked, standing in the guard's box as if it were just a stage for a tourist show. His intention had been innocent, but now he realized how wrong it had been. The guard's voice had not just been loud, it had been commanding, filled with authority that reminded everyone present that this was not just a place for entertainment, but a place of tradition and dignity. The atmosphere around the palace shifted. Parents began warning their children more firmly not to get too close. One man said to his family, "See, you don't play around with the King's Guard. They're not here for jokes." Another tourist whispered, "I've heard they're trained soldiers, not actors. They can shout like that if you cross the line." Li Wei listened quietly, every word reminding him of his mistake. Though embarrassed, he noticed something strange. The more people whispered about the guard's shout, the less they focused on laughing at him. Instead, they seemed impressed by the guard's discipline. The moment became less about his mistake and more about the guard's duty. That gave Li Wei a small sense of relief. Perhaps he would not be remembered as a clown, but as part of a story that showed everyone the seriousness of the guards. Still, the memory replayed in his mind. He remembered stepping into the box so proudly, thinking it was harmless. Then he remembered the instant shift, the deep voice cutting through the air, He realized the guard had only spoken 4 words. But those 4 words carried centuries of royal tradition and respect. It was a reminder that the guards were not ornaments but living symbols of loyalty. His friends finally pulled him gently toward the side, away from the direct gaze of the crowd. They whispered, "Forget it. Don't think too much. We'll go get some coffee later." Li Wei nodded, but his heart was heavy. He glanced back at the guard. The soldier was once again standing completely still, as if nothing had happened. The silence returned, and it was almost unbelievable that the same man had shouted so powerfully only moments earlier. The calmness of the guard made Li Wei think even more. It showed discipline beyond imagination. One moment he had broken the silence with thunder, and the next moment he had returned to being a statue of loyalty. Li Wei admired that strength. He whispered softly to himself, "This is real duty. This is respect." As the minutes passed, the incident turned into a story inside the crowd. People began to retell it to others who had not seen it clearly. "Did you hear the guard?" one man asked his wife. "Yes, it was so loud," she replied. Another person said, "He told that man to get out of the box. It was like a movie scene." These conversations spread quickly, almost as if the moment was becoming bigger than what it actually was. A few tourists tried to catch Li Wei's eyes, but he kept looking down. He knew some people were curious about him, but he wanted no more attention. He just wanted to disappear into the crowd and become another anonymous tourist. Unfortunately, it was too late. Some of the videos were already being shared online. A teenager excitedly said, "This will go viral for sure." Li Wei heard the words and felt a cold shiver. He imagined people back home watching the clip, laughing at his mistake. But deep inside, he also felt something else. The moment had humbled him. It had reminded him that respect was not about nationality, language, or culture. It was about understanding the values of a place and honoring them. He thought about how in China, there were sacred places where visitors were asked to show respect. He would never think of playing around in such places back home. Why then had he thought it was okay here? The realization sank deep into his heart. The incident did not just teach him a lesson, it also changed the way he looked at the guard. Before he had seen them as silent statues, interesting for photos. Now he saw them as protectors, men who stood in silence not because they wanted to be watched, but because they carried the pride of their nation on their shoulders. That silence was heavy with meaning. The crowd slowly returned to normal, though the energy remained different. There was more respect in the air. People looked at the guards with new eyes, their admiration mixed with caution. Even the children stayed quieter, their parents' warning still fresh in their ears. Li Wei, meanwhile, stood quietly at the side, his thoughts running deep. He knew he would never forget this day, not because of the photos he had planned, but because of the shout that reminded him of something bigger than himself. For the rest of that hour, he stayed near the palace but did not dare step close to the guard again. He took pictures from a respectful distance, capturing the beauty of the palace and the seriousness of the soldiers. Each click of the camera now felt different, carrying more weight and meaning. Instead of just collecting funny memories, he was collecting lessons about respect and responsibility. When the crowd began to move again, preparing for the changing of the guard, Li Wei looked once more at the soldier who had shouted at him. The man stood tall, his face calm, his eyes fixed forward. To the soldier, the event was over, just another moment in his duty. But to Li Wei, it was unforgettable. He whispered quietly, "Thank you," though he knew the guard would not reply. The sound of the guard's voice still lingered in Li Wei's mind even though several minutes had passed. He had stepped aside with his friends, but the crowd's energy had shifted in a way he could not ignore. People no longer looked at the palace the same way. The air was thicker, heavier with respect. The tourists, who earlier treated the guards like statues for entertainment, now spoke with lowered voices. The echo of that single command had reminded everyone that they were not watching a show. They were standing near men with real responsibility. A group of school children leaned against the railing, whispering to their teacher. "Miss, why did the guard shout like that?" one child asked. The teacher replied softly, "Because the guard's duty is important. No one is allowed to disturb them." The children nodded slowly, their excitement replaced by caution. Li Wei, overhearing this, felt his heart sink even deeper. He realized the teacher's words were meant not only for the children but also as a gentle message to adults like him. Nearby, a middle-aged couple from Germany replayed a video on their phone. The man laughed softly, saying, "Listen to that voice, it was like thunder." His wife, however, shook her head. "I don't think it's funny. That poor tourist must feel terrible." Li Wei caught their words, and though he didn't understand every syllable, their tone told him enough. Some people laughed, others pitied, but everyone had an opinion. He was at the center of it all, whether he wanted it or not. Li Wei's friends tried to distract him. "Come, let's take photos from this side," one of them suggested. They pointed to the grand palace gates shining under the sunlight. He followed them quietly, lifting his camera, but his hands shook. Every click of the shutter reminded him of the mistake. He looked at the guard again. The soldier stood motionless, his face firm, his eyes hidden under the brim of the tall black hat. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the shout had never escaped his lips. Yet Li Wei knew better. He had felt that voice inside his bones. Suddenly, a group of young tourists from France started cheering. They had captured the whole moment on video and were already sharing it online. One of them said proudly, "This will get thousands of views." Another added, "Maybe even millions." The sound of those words made Li Wei's heart sink lower. He imagined his family and co-workers back home scrolling through their phones and seeing his face. They would laugh, perhaps not in a cruel way, but in a way that would still sting. He covered his face for a moment, pretending to adjust his camera, but really he was hiding from the world. Despite his embarrassment, a small part of him began to think differently. Maybe, just maybe, this moment could teach others something too. If people watched the video, perhaps they would realize how serious the King's Guard was. Perhaps they would think twice before making the same mistake. He told himself, "If I am the example, then at least others will learn from me." It was a strange comfort, but it helped him breathe more steadily. The palace square buzzed with mixed emotions. Some tourists whispered stories of past incidents. "I heard one time a guard stomped his foot at a tourist," someone said. "Really, I thought they never move," replied another. Li Wei listened silently, realizing he had joined a list of people who had tested the limits of the guards. But unlike a rumor, his moment had witnesses, cameras, and soon the internet. That truth weighed on him like a heavy bag on his shoulders. As the sun rose higher, shadows stretched across the square. The air grew warmer, but Li Wei felt cold inside. His friends bought cold drinks from a nearby stall, offering him one, but he barely tasted it. He stared at the guard box, the place where his mistake had begun. It looked so simple, just a painted wooden shelter, yet it held power. It was a place of duty, not of play. He finally admitted to himself, "I treated it like a toy. That was wrong." The honesty hurt, but it also gave him clarity. Then something unexpected happened. A tourist from India approached him gently, smiling kindly. "Don't worry," the man said in broken English. "You are not the first and you will not be the last. Many people make small mistakes. You will laugh about it one day." Li Wei looked up, surprised by the kindness. For the first time since the shout, he felt a little lighter. Not everyone was judging. Some understood it was a human mistake. He bowed slightly in gratitude, his eyes softening. The incident became part of the palace experience for everyone there. Tourists now took photos with a different mood. They stood a little farther back, spoke more quietly, and moved with more care. Li Wei noticed that even though his mistake embarrassed him, it had created a ripple of respect in the crowd. Parents corrected their children, young people stopped joking, and the guard stood taller than ever in everyone's eyes. Hours passed, and still, whispers about the shout continued. Li Wei's friends teased him gently but with affection, not cruelty. "You gave us a memory," one said. "When we return home, this is the story we will tell." Another added, "At least it wasn't worse. Imagine if the guard had called for police." Li Wei winced at the thought but nodded. Yes, it could have been worse. He should be grateful it ended with just a voice and not something more serious. Later, when the crowd gathered for the official changing of the guard ceremony, the atmosphere was electric. The soldiers marched in perfect rhythm, their boots striking the ground in unison, their rifles shining under the sun. The music of the military band filled the air and everyone clapped in admiration. Li Wei watched carefully, every detail sinking into his mind. He realized that what he had treated like entertainment was actually a tradition with deep roots. The precision, the loyalty, and the pride of the soldiers were clear in every step. For the first time, he felt true awe instead of curiosity. The guards were not just men in costumes. They were symbols of discipline and history. Their silence was not weakness but strength. Their stillness was not emptiness but purpose. The shout he had heard earlier now felt even more meaningful. It was not anger but protection, not harshness but duty. As the ceremony ended, the crowd applauded. Li Wei clapped too, but with a different heart. His claps were not just for the show, but for the respect he had learned. He looked at the guard who had shouted at him earlier. The soldier marched away, blending into the line of others, faceless and strong. Li Wei whispered quietly, "Thank you," knowing the guard would never hear, yet feeling it mattered anyway. When the crowd finally began to leave, Li Wei walked slowly with his friends. He carried not just his camera, but a new weight inside him, the weight of humility, respect, and understanding. He had come looking for fun, but he was leaving with a lesson. And though he still feared the video spreading online, he also felt that maybe, just maybe, his mistake would teach thousands of strangers the same lesson it had taught him. The incident with the shout had changed the whole atmosphere around Buckingham Palace. For hours, tourists spoke about it in low voices. The video recordings had already spread among the crowd, and more people arrived later, already aware of what had happened. Some came not only to see the palace but also to ask, "Is this where the guard shouted at the tourist?" It had become part of the day's story. Li Wei, however, was still quiet. He stayed close to his friends, walking slowly, his mind replaying the moment again and again. Every time he remembered the sound of the guard's voice, his chest tightened. He thought about how one small decision, stepping into that box, had created such a storm. He could not erase it, but he wished he could. His friends tried to lighten the mood. One of them joked softly, "At least now you are famous." Another added, "You should smile, it's just a story now." But Li Wei didn't laugh. He knew it wasn't only about being embarrassed. It was about respect, and how he had failed to show it in a place where tradition mattered so much. As they stood near the gates, an older man, a local Londoner, came closer. He had been watching the guards for years, almost like a routine. He spoke with a gentle tone. "Young man, don't take it too hard. Many visitors don't understand the seriousness of the guards. You made a mistake, yes, but you have learned now. That is enough." Li Wei listened carefully. The man's words comforted him. It was true. He could not change what had happened, but he could change how he acted in the future. He bowed his head slightly and said, "Thank you." The man smiled and walked away, leaving Li Wei with a little more peace. As the day went on, tourists continued to speak about the guard. Some described the shout with excitement, others with surprise, but most agreed it was unforgettable. A woman from Italy told her daughter, "This shows you why we must always respect soldiers, even when they are silent." A student from Canada said to his friend, "It felt like the whole place shook when he shouted." The story was no longer just about Li Wei. It was about the power of tradition, and everyone carried it home as part of their London memory. Li Wei, however, felt something deeper. He realized how easily people forget the meaning of things when they treat everything like a photo opportunity. He himself had been guilty of this. He had seen the guard as part of the scenery, not as a living man carrying the weight of his duty. That thought humbled him. Later in the afternoon, he and his friends sat at a small cafe near the palace. They ordered tea and sandwiches, but Li Wei barely ate. His mind was elsewhere. He looked at the palace from a distance, still hearing the echo of the guard's command. His friends spoke about their travel plans, about visiting Big Ben and the London Eye, but Li Wei stayed quiet until one friend asked, "Are you still thinking about it?" "Yes," Li Wei admitted. "I feel I disrespected them. I didn't mean to, but I did." His friend leaned forward. "But you learned. That's more important. Sometimes mistakes teach us better than books." Li Wei nodded slowly. That was true. Back home, he had always respected traditions at temples and monuments. Why had he forgotten to do the same here? Maybe because he was too excited. Maybe because he thought travel was about collecting funny photos instead of meaningful memories. Now he knew better. As evening came, the palace lights turned golden and the guards were still standing strong. The crowd had thinned, but there were still visitors taking pictures. Li Wei stood again near the gates, looking at the guard who had shouted at him earlier. The soldier remained still, silent, disciplined, as if the earlier event had never happened. That calmness amazed Li Wei even more. He realized the guard had not shouted out of anger but out of duty. It was his job to protect the dignity of the place, and he had done it perfectly. Li Wei whispered quietly to himself, "I respect you." He knew the guard would never hear it, but saying the words felt right. As the day closed, people who had been present began telling their own versions of the story to others. Some laughed, some exaggerated, but all agreed that the guard's voice was unforgettable. The videos traveled quickly online, reaching strangers who had never been to London. For many, the clip became proof that the King's Guard was not to be taken lightly. Li Wei worried about the video reaching his family, but a part of him also felt proud in an unusual way. Not proud of his mistake, but proud that the moment showed the world something real, the strength behind the silence of the guards. If his embarrassment became the reason people respected the palace more, then maybe it wasn't all bad. The night sky grew darker, and the crowd finally left. Li Wei and his friends walked back toward their hotel, their steps slow, their conversations lighter. His friends laughed about other parts of the day, about souvenirs and meals, but Li Wei stayed thoughtful. He had started the day with excitement, made a mistake, felt shame, and now ended with understanding. It was a full journey, not of miles, but of lessons. When he finally lay in bed that night, he closed his eyes and saw the guard again, standing tall, silent, unshaken. He thought of the voice that had cut through the crowd, the 4 words that had changed everything. Get out of the box. Those words would stay with him forever, not as a punishment, but as guidance. They would remind him, wherever he traveled in the future, to respect every place, every tradition, every person standing in silence for something greater than themselves. He smiled faintly in the dark. Tomorrow would be a new day, full of new places and adventures. But this day, the day the King's Guard shouted at him, would always be the one that taught him respect. By the next morning, the story of the King's Guard shouting at Li Wei was already spreading far beyond the palace gates. Videos had been uploaded on social media, and clips were appearing on news feeds. Tourists who had been present the previous day shared their experiences online, writing comments like, "I was there when it happened," or "The guard's voice was so powerful." Some praised the guard for protecting tradition, while others sympathized with the tourist, saying it had been a harmless mistake. Li Wei sat in his hotel room scrolling through his phone. His face appeared in some of the videos, standing awkwardly inside the guard's box just moments before the shout. He felt a mix of shame and disbelief as he watched himself. The comments were divided. Some people laughed and wrote things like, "What was he thinking?" Others defended him, saying he probably didn't know the rules. The more he read, the heavier his heart felt. His friends tried to cheer him up. "Don't worry," one said, patting his shoulder. "This will be old news in a few days. People always move on." Another added, "At least now you are part of history. Not many tourists get a shout from the King's Guard." Li Wei gave a small smile, but deep inside he felt uneasy. He didn't want to be remembered for breaking rules, even by accident. He wanted his travels to be about learning and respect, not about embarrassment. Later that day, the group went out to see more of London. They visited the Tower Bridge, the River Thames, and the famous museums. Everywhere they went, Li Wei kept thinking about what had happened at Buckingham Palace. The image of the guard standing tall, silent again after shouting, stayed with him. The guard's voice was no longer in his ears, but it was still in his heart. At lunch, his friends asked him what he was thinking. Li Wei replied honestly, "I think I was too focused on pictures and forgot the meaning of the place. The guard is not for my entertainment. He is there for duty, for respect." His friends nodded in agreement. They too realized that as tourists, they sometimes treated traditions lightly without thinking deeply about them. The incident had not only taught Li Wei a lesson, but also made his whole group more aware. Back at Buckingham Palace, new crowds of tourists were gathering. Many had already heard about the shouting incident and came curious to see if something like that would happen again. Parents reminded their children not to cross the ropes, and guides warned their groups about the rules. Without knowing it, Li Wei's mistake had educated countless people. It was as if the guard's voice had traveled further than the palace gates, reaching hearts around the world. In the evening, Li Wei sat by the window of his hotel room, looking out at the city lights. He thought about his journey so far. London had given him beauty, history, and culture, but also a lesson he would never forget. He whispered to himself, "Respect is the most important souvenir I can take home." That thought made him feel lighter. When he returned to China weeks later, family and friends asked about his trip. They wanted to hear about Big Ben, the London Eye, the museums, and the food. But the story that came out most often was the one about Buckingham Palace. His friends laughed when he told them the guard had shouted at him. His parents shook their heads and said, "You should be more careful." At first, Li Wei felt embarrassed all over again, but then he noticed something. People were not just laughing at him. They were also listening to the message behind the story. He explained to them, "It wasn't only about me being shouted at. It was about respect. The guards are real soldiers. They stand for their country, for tradition. I forgot that for a moment. But now, I understand better. Wherever I go in the future, I will show respect first." His words carried weight and his family nodded in agreement. The video of the incident continued to circulate online, sometimes reappearing weeks later with new comments. But Li Wei no longer felt the same sting when he saw it. Instead, he saw it as a reminder of how small actions can have big consequences and how respect is a language that crosses all cultures. He even began to tell the story himself with a light smile, not to brag but to share the lesson. One day, while showing photos from his trip at work, a colleague asked him, "Weren't you the one in that video?" Li Wei hesitated, then admitted, "Yes, that was me." The colleague laughed, but Li Wei calmly explained the lesson he had learned. To his surprise, the colleague nodded thoughtfully and said, "That's true. Sometimes we forget how important traditions are. Thank you for reminding me." For the first time, Li Wei felt that his mistake had actually created something good. Years later, Li Wei would still remember that moment at Buckingham Palace. He traveled to other countries, visiting temples, museums, and monuments. In each place, he moved carefully, showing respect. Whenever he saw other tourists about to make the same kind of mistake he had once made, he would gently advise them, "Don't do that. Respect this place. You don't want to hear a voice like I once did." His friends laughed at how serious he became, but he didn't mind. The lesson was worth repeating. And somewhere in the background of countless tourist memories, the king's guard continued to stand silently, hour after hour, day after day. To some, they remained statues in red coats and tall hats. But to Li Wei, they were much more. They were teachers of discipline, reminders of tradition, and symbols of respect. He never forgot the 4 words that had once shaken him to his core. Get out of the box. Simple words, spoken with authority that turned his laughter into humility and his mistake into wisdom. Words that had embarrassed him in front of a crowd but later guided him for a lifetime. Words that reminded him that even silence can have power, and that when silence breaks, it is not to be ignored. In the end, Li Wei carried the memory not as a scar but as a treasure. His mistake had made him wiser, his embarrassment had made him humble, and his story had made others careful. For him, Buckingham Palace would never just be a tourist attraction. It would always be the place where he learned the meaning of respect,